What is up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Backup Fantasy Sports. It is Wednesday, February 7th. Preseason testing is this month. There will be a Grand Prix next month, March 2nd. It is very exciting times in F1 and the F1 fantasy space. A lot of news broke last week. Didn't really cover it all that much. More of an F1 fantasy show, but Lewis Hamilton going to Ferrari. Wow. F1 fantasy takeaways would be that Mercedes are driving a truck this year and Hamilton is not impressed. So we will have to see how that goes in preseason testing. But on today's episode, we are going to be into some F1 fantasy and I'm going to track the trends from 2023. Look at some splits where drivers kind of thrived, where they were not so good, and see if there's anything we can take away for that into the 2024 season. But before we get into all that, if you could like and subscribe to the channel, that way you can stay up to date with all my F1 fantasy content that is coming out over the next month. That would be great. And you can follow me on X or TikTok at UNFPL, where I will be posting some short form content very shortly. So let's get into today's episode here with tracking the trends. I got a few categories here, six, I think, five or six. And we are going to just kind of break it all down. So first one is pre versus post summer break. I wanted to do first half, second half, but pre and post summer break is pretty much the same thing. So who thrived in the first half versus the second half? Well, quite obvious, McLaren were spectacular in the second half of the season. So they get the biggest split in the post summer break kind of charts here. So this is their average from the pre summer break scoring to what they scored after the summer break, just so you know. So positive numbers mean they did well in the second half of the season. Negative numbers mean that they did well in the first half compared to the second half. So I've got the top five and the bottom five here for each slide that we are going to go through today. Norris had 17.6 more points per race than he did in the first half after McLaren improved their car tremendously. Not surprisingly, Oscar Piastri was second here with 14-point increase. Carlos Sainz, 9-point increase. So Ferrari got stronger as the year went along, as did Carlos Sainz. He picked up that win in Singapore. So good job by him. Pierre Gasly and Yuki Tsunoda there, 6.9 and 6 points per race increase for themselves as well. But the main strugglers here, Perez, 14.2. That's how many points less per race he scored in the second half of the season compared to the first. We all know the struggles. We all remember Mexico. We all remember Japan. Those were not good races for the Mexican driver. And he struggled after a pretty good first half, started the year off strong. There are even those rumors, once again, that happens every year where, like, can Sergio contend with Max? But it was not meant to be this season. So yeah, Perez suffered the most in the second half of the year after his roller coaster like post summer break. Alonso there, as the Aston Martin car failed to keep up its first half progress, it kind of fell behind the McLarens. And Alonso suffered the most. Hamilton down here, negative 5.3, Bottas 4.8, and Logan Sargent, negative 3.7. Sargent's mostly came from DNFs. He was okay in the first half, kind of kept it clean, but had 3 or 4 DNFs in the last 10 races of the season for the post-summer break. But this is kind of, hopefully this will mean that McLaren bring this form into 2024. We can kind of build off of this and we can expect them to be a genuine contender for the podium week in and week out like they showed in the second half, but throughout the season, because they struggled in the first half. Lando Norris, obviously, I mean, he scored 17.6 more points per race in the second half of the season. Next up here, we have day races versus night races. Not a ton to go on here, as there aren't many night races, about 6 across the whole season. Oscar Piastri did better in night races, and that is boosted by his win in the Qatar sprint. So I didn't take out the sprint points for these splits here, as That was a little bit too much maths for me on a Wednesday morning, but Piastri here thrived at night with 11 points per race more than during days. Leclerc 8.9, Zhou Guanyu 8.3, Kevin Magnussen 6.6, and George Russell down there 2.4. So he wasn't really a significant split. But Piastri, Leclerc, and Zhou Guanyu, those are they seem to do better at nighttime. Ferrari kind of had some tire management issues, so that's interesting there as well. 8.9 points per race better. And that's interesting because Ferrari will be the entire grid will be having 2 night races to begin the year in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia on Saturday nights this year. So don't forget that for your first F1 fantasy deadline. Drivers who suffered in the day or at night compared to their day races. Nico Hulkenberg had 8 points per race less. Lando Norris, negative 7.9. That could be due to his DNF in Vegas in the second to last race of the season. Lewis Hamilton, negative 4.1. Sergio Perez, negative 3.6. And Esteban Ocon, negative 2.8. It was a pretty rough year for the French driver, as you will see in one of these upcoming splits. But the main takeaway I would have from this one is Ferrari did look stronger when it was cooler temperatures. They didn't have to really deal with tire degradation all that much. So Leclerc 8.9 was a positive development. And that's even including his rough start to the year in Bahrain. Next up here, traditional versus street races. Lots of more street races coming on the F1 calendar, unfortunately, but they classified 7 races as street races. So these are the guys who did better in street races versus the traditional track. So Sergio Perez, king of the streets, as he has been knighted here in F1 circles, 11.3 points per race more in street races than he had in traditional tracks. Esteban Ocon, 9.5. That's boosted by a Monaco podium that he had to begin the season last year. Charles Leclerc, 6.2. Carlos Sainz, 4.3. Lewis Hamilton, 4.2. That's kind of surprising there. And the worst drivers in the traditional versus street race split, Lando Norris, again, slightly skewed by the Vegas DNF, negative 18.9. And also with the way the F1 calendar was constructed last year, I think like 5 of the first 7 races were street tracks when McLaren was also suffering mightily in their car development. So they didn't really pick up until Austria, Canada, Silverstone, that kind of area of the season. So a lot of the street races had already taken place, and McLaren's car struggled in the first third of the season, first half of the season. And then they really took off in the second half of the year. And so Lando Norris had that to contend with and his Vegas DNF, which was classed as a street track. Alexander Albon, likewise, Williams kind of got off to a tough start in 2023. They were suffering, but he picked it up as the season went along. So towards the beginning of the season is when Williams was struggling the most, negative 12.4 points per race in a traditional versus street track. Tsunoda 8.3, Russell 6.3, and Verstappen 4.3. But for Verstappen, it's just not that big a deal. I think his points mostly came from the couple of qualifyings where he suffered in Miami and in Saudi Arabia, where he had a couple of bad qualifyings and he kind of lost some points there, although he did gain them in overtakes. But George Russell with his Singapore DNF as well, that will probably be in these numbers. But yeah, Sergio Perez proves to be king of the streets with his 11.3 points per race more in street tracks versus traditional tracks. DNF versus no DNF. This is just kind of, I want to normalize the points. So see who suffered the most versus their season average if you took out all the DNF. So Verstappen did not DNF. So he had the best. He had the same amount of points per race as he did with a DNF or not. Lewis Hamilton, negative 0.9. Gasly, negative 0.9. Norris, negative 0.9, which means they all suffered 1 DNF. I did not count the disqualification for Lewis Hamilton or Charles Leclerc in these numbers, as that is not a DNF or did not classify or whatever you want to call it. This is the did not classify according to F1 Fantasy. Esteban Ocon, he had a really rough 2023. He suffered 6.3 points per race less due to his DNF. So Regression for the Frenchman this season seems likely. Like, you can't expect him to DNF that much again in back-to-back seasons. Logan Sargent, if he can clean it up, he could be in my driver's price predictions, which you should definitely check out. He came in as the lowest driver on the grid in terms of my price predictions, but hopefully with some fewer DNFs, he will be able to move up the F1 fantasy standings a little bit. Sergio Perez, he had some DNFs, obviously negative 3.9, Alexander Albon, negative 3.7, and Charles Leclerc, negative 3.7. So, I mean, Verstappen, it feels on like Red Bull pretty dominant, but can we expect him to go another season without a DNF? I mean, if you remember at the beginning of the 2022 season, Verstappen DNF'd in 2 of the first 3 races, and we really thought we had a title chase on with Leclerc versus Verstappen. Alas, it was not meant to be, but at the beginning, even Red Bull was suffering some DNF. So can Verstappen really go 2 years in a row without a DNF? I'm not so sure. Something will have to come back to bite Red Bull on the track here. The last split I have here is one stop versus multi-stop races. So kind of just went through the data and looked at mostly one stop races versus whenever the field had multiple stops. It's mostly like, did the top 4 or 5 teams only take one stop in this race? Then I classed that as a one stop race. And multi-stop was when you saw like Max Verstappen took 2 or 3 pit stops. That was likely a multi-stop race for everyone. So the guys that suffered here in multi-stop races, the Ferraris, not super surprising there, given their tumultuous time on the pit wall. But Sergio Perez, negative 9. He led the field in the difference between one stop versus multi-stop. So he suffered the most in a multi-stop race. Sergio Perez, negative 9 points per race. Charles Leclerc, 7.5. Carlos Sainz, negative 7.5. Ferrari just struggling there. Logan Sargent and Lewis Hamilton, barely any difference there in their stop. So it was mainly those top 3 guys were the only ones that suffered in one stop versus multi-stop race. Sergio Perez, Charles Leclerc, and Carlos Sainz. The drivers who thrived in one-stop races, Yuki Tsunoda, 15.2 points per race. Esteban Ocon, 13.5. Lance Stroll, 8.7. Lando Norris, 7.9. And even Valtteri Bottas, 7 points per race more in one-stop races versus multi-stop races. Interesting to see Tsunoda do so well there. This does include the Qatar Grand Prix, obviously, where they were mandated to change their tires 2 or 3 times. I can't even remember how many times they had to change their tires there, but that is included in these stats. So Yuki Tsunoda, 15.2 points per race. We'll see how that goes with the Visa Cash App Red Bull pit stops for 2024. Are they going to be faster? We'll see. S1 Ocon, interesting. Here, he was really a dead asset in F1 Fantasy last year, but could he be back on the rise? Showed some speed, and well, he got the Monaco podium. He had some bad luck in Australia. If you don't remember, him and Pierre Gasly kind of crashing into each other, but lots of DNFs last season, and there should be some regression for the French driver, for the French outfit. But these are just kind of some stats that I want to look at, tracking the trends. So I kind of put all of these trends and all this stuff into like I kind of ranked them in an Excel spreadsheet, and I broke it all down and tried to predict how we were going to do over the first 6 races, because we want to make something from all this data here. So the first 6 race predictions. So the first 6 races of the year are Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Australia, Japan, China, and Miami. China and Miami are sprint races. I did not include those in kind of the points totals because I was just going to get too messy. But I've broken it down by race or track type, the time that those races will be taking place, and what they are traditionally as stops. Are they multi-stop race or a one-stop race? So Bahrain and Saudi Arabia are both night races. Everything else is a day race. We've got 3 street tracks in the first 6 races with Saudi Arabia, and they class Australia as a street race and Miami as a street race. And then stops, we've only got Saudi Arabia and Miami as one stops here. So took all of this, kind of filtered it through the data. I ranked all the drivers through each of these kind of filters, and this is what I came up with here. For the first 6 race predictions, I had the top 10 because In F1 Fantasy, the top 10 are the only people who score in qualifying, in sprints, and at the race point. So I didn't want to go all through 20 places. I wasn't going to predict overtakes and pit stop points and all that stuff. So you'll see here that Verstappen, Perez, and Hamilton are 1, 2, 3 on the board because they just did the strongest in all of the categories. So they dominate the first 6 races. This is a very basic race predictions. So let me know what you highly disagree with in the comments, and I will get back to you. So Verstappen, Perez, Hamilton, 1, 2, 3 for all 6 races, according to the very basic maths that I did here. Norris had 3 fourth places. He had a 9th place and an 8th place as well among those. So that could be interesting, kind of up and down for McLaren, but he's expected to do quite well in Bahrain to begin the year if McLaren can kind of keep it together as their back end of 2023 form showed. But Bahrain, here's the top 10 for the first race of the season. So this is all the entire thing. I don't want to just list names, but if you are listening on the podcast, just flip over to the YouTube channel and you can see the top 10 for the first 6 races. But for Bahrain, I will say it's Verstappen, Perez, Hamilton, Norris, George Russell, Fernando Alonso, Charles Leclerc, Carlos Sainz, Oscar Piastri, and Lance Stroll. There's actually only 11 drivers on this list out of the first 6 races. So it's all of those plus Pierre Gasly. He's the 11th driver that sneaks into the top 10 in the first 6 race predictions. Very basic maths, but kind of wanted to try and put something together with all of that data that I just collected from the splits. So over the first 6 race predictions, I added them all up, averaged them out, and here are the kind of where everyone comes out over the first 6 races with their average position. So it would go Verstappen, Perez, Hamilton. I guess it'd be like a power rankings of the first 6 races predictions. So take that as you will. Once again, if you're on the podcast side, just flip over. You got the whole chart here, but I will list it off here. So Verstappen, Sergio Perez, Lewis Hamilton, Carlos Sainz, Fernando Alonso, Lando Norris, George Russell, Charles Leclerc, Oscar Piastri, Lance Stroll, Pierre Gasly, Daniel Ricciardo, Yuki Tsunoda, Joe Guan Yu, Esteban Ocon all the way down there, kind of taking his tough 2023 in there. I couldn't normalize his projections. Kevin Magnussen, Alexander Albon, Nico Hulkenberg, Valtteri Bottas, and Logan Sargent down there in 20th. So that would be how they placed over the first 6 races. So last week I did the second part of my price predictions kind of video. So the first one was drivers, second one was constructors, and then I put some teams together and some of you guys gave some feedback, and one of those people were at Leapsfrog. So thank you for your comments there. And he put together 3 teams, and I just used all the data that I just put together and I shoved them into his teams that he suggested, and it came out with some pretty interesting results. So he gave me 3 hypothetical builds in his comments. So love the feedback. Anyone got any other feedback, please leave me a comment below or hit me up on X at EwanFPL. So his first team was Red Bull, Visa RB, Verstappen, Perez, Sonoda, Ricardo, and Joe Guan Yu. And I took the race predictions that I just did there, and I only did qualifying and race points. I did it very basically, like where they finished in the race. That's where I said they would qualify. I kind of put it all together like that. No overtakes, no positions gained. I'm not that good at this stuff. So I had Red Bull, Visa RB, Verstappen, Perez, Sonoda, Ricardo, and Joe Guan Yu in Leapsfrog's first team. And those 7 assets would average 124 points per race. His second team was also Red Bull, Visa RB, Verstappen. Then he switched it up here with Lando Norris, Fernando Alonso, Yuki Tsunoda, and Daniel Ricciardo. That was 122.8 points. And then his third team is the most interesting by far. So Red Bull and McLaren, which puts a lot of money in your constructors, but it's probably the 2 strongest bang for your buck constructors on the grid here, according to my price predictions, at least. And then Verstappen, he kept in all 3 teams. And then Norris, Piastri, Magnussen, and Sargent. So kind of going stars and scrubs here, a little bit more balanced than team 1. And that actually came out with 130.6 average points per race. So very interesting there that maybe you can get rid of Perez, substitute him in with a Norris and a Piastri, and that'll get you up to McLaren as your constructor with my price predictions. And that gives you a more well-rounded team, but you do have to suffer with Magnussen and Logan Sargent. Haas came out with their car, or kind of their renders, there we go, that's the word, of their car this week, and their new team principal pretty much said, we expect to be dead last this year. So yikes for Haas in 2024. But yeah, that would be stars and scrubsy there. That last team: Red Bull, McLaren, Verstappen, Norris, Piastri, Magnussen, and Sargent, 130.6. But that is the best team that graded out in that very basic data models that I put together here. But that is the whole episode, tracking the trends, some interesting splits that I found in the data, just kind of trying to get an edge for the early part of the 2024 F1 fantasy season. Still waiting for the game to launch. Last year, it did not launch until after preseason testing, if my memory is correct. And it was kind of a mad rush that last week. So hold on tight for that. That will be a week-long slug of content coming out of the Backup Fantasy Sports YouTube channel. But once again, if you can like and subscribe to the podcast, would greatly appreciate it. Any feedback is always appreciated on the YouTube comments or on X or TikTok at UNFPL. So don't forget to hit me up there. But enjoy the team launch season. We've had Kick Sauber, we've had Haas a little bit, Williams as well. A lot of shakedowns happening this weekend as well, with more liveries being revealed over the next week. But once again, thanks for listening, and I will talk to you next time.